October 14th, 1943, 23,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Staff Sergeant Tom Morrison grips the controls of his B-17 Flying Fortress, Devil's Own, as German flak tears through the formation like a meat grinder. His number 3 engine erupts in flames, not from fire, but from catastrophic oil loss. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone seizes in seconds, the propeller windmilling violently, creating drag that threatens to flip the bomber into a death spiral. Morrison reaches for the feathering button. Nothing happens. The hydraulic system is shredded. The propeller spins faster, hammering the airframe. Oil temperature gauges slam into the red zone on engine number 4. Then number 2. The domino effect every B-17 pilot fears. "We're losing oil pressure across the board," his co-pilot shouts over the intercom. In the formation around them, 60 B-17s will not make it home today. 60 crews, 600 men, dead or captured because of one systemic failure the Army Air Forces knows about but cannot solve. The official survival rate for this mission will be 79% losses in some bomb groups. The average B-17 survives just 11 missions before going down. What Morrison doesn't know is that 300 miles away, in a freezing maintenance hangar at RAF Bassingbourn, a 32-year-old crew chief with no engineering degree has just finished an unauthorized modification that the top brass will call criminally reckless when they find out. A modification so simple it uses parts from a tractor engine. A modification that violates 3 separate Army Air Forces technical orders. But in 6 weeks, this mechanic's insane trick will be the difference between the 8th Air Force continuing deep penetration raids into Germany, or abandoning daylight bombing altogether. By February 1944, the survival rate will improve from 25% completing their tour to over 50%. Thousands of airmen will owe their lives to a fix that started in a secret workshop with a welding torch and a $4 valve. This is the story of how Master Sergeant Paul McKenzie, a former Caterpillar tractor mechanic from Nebraska who barely graduated high school, saved the B-17 program with a trick so simple senior engineers couldn't believe it worked, until the combat data proved them wrong. By late summer 1943, the 8th Air Force faces a crisis that threatens to end the combined bomber offensive before it can cripple Nazi Germany's war machine. The problem isn't German fighters or flak, it's the B-17's own engines killing crews. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone is a masterpiece of engineering. 9 cylinders, 1,200 horsepower, supercharged for high-altitude performance. But it has an Achilles heel that manifests at 25,000 feet over hostile territory. When combat damage punctures an oil line, even a small hit, the engine loses oil pressure within 90 seconds. Oil temperature spikes from 75 degrees Celsius to 120 degrees. The engine seizes. Here's where the death spiral begins. The seized engine's propeller continues windmilling in the slipstream, creating massive drag on one side of the aircraft. Pilots are trained to feather the propeller, rotate the blades edge onto the wind to stop the windmilling. But the feathering mechanism requires hydraulic pressure, which requires oil pressure, which the damaged engine no longer has. The propeller keeps spinning, dragging the bomber sideways, forcing the remaining engines to work at emergency power to compensate. Those overworked engines now run hotter. Their oil coolers, already inadequate at combat altitude, cannot dissipate the extra heat. Within 6 to 8 minutes, oil temperatures on the remaining engines climb into critical ranges. The oil breaks down. Viscosity drops. Bearings start to fail. A second engine seizes, then a third. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bomb Group, sees it happen on 42% of damaged bombers that start the mission with full crews. "We're not losing planes to combat damage," he tells 8th Air Force Headquarters in September 1943. We're losing them to a cascading thermal failure that starts the moment one engine takes a hit. The boys call it bleeding out. Boeing engineers propose solutions: larger oil coolers, additional cooling fins, revised oil circulation pumps. Each modification adds weight, reduces bomb load, takes months to implement across 12,000 aircraft. Wright Aeronautical Corporation suggests switching to synthetic oil with higher thermal tolerance. The Pentagon estimates 18 months for testing and certification. The 8th Air Force doesn't have 18 months. After the August 17th Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid costs 60 bombers, operational planners calculate that at current loss rates, the bomber fleet will be combat ineffective by December. The second Schweinfurt mission on October 14th, Black Thursday, validates their worst fears. Of 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 are shot down, 17 are written off due to damage, and 121 return with battle damage. The mission abort rate due to engine failure, 31%. Major General Ira Eaker, commanding 8th Air Force, receives a blunt assessment from his engineering staff. The B-17's engine cooling system was designed for peacetime test parameters, not combat conditions. Sustained high-altitude operations with battle damage exceed design specifications. Without a fundamental redesign, loss rates will remain unsustainable. The technical manual is 3,000 pages. The official modification proposal process requires approval from Wright Field, Wright Aeronautical, Boeing, the Material Command, and the Secretary of War. Minimum timeline, 8 months. In the enlisted mechanics barracks at Bassingbourn, Master Sergeant Paul McKenzie reads the engineering report with growing frustration. He's been maintaining B-17s since June 1942. He's seen 43 bombers come back with single-engine damage and end up written off because cascading failures destroyed 3 or 4 engines. He's watched crews die in emergency landings because overheated engines caught fire on approach. And he's noticed something the engineers haven't. Something in how the oil flows when an engine is damaged. Something he first learned fixing Caterpillar D7 bulldozers in the Nebraska dust. The official solution is still months away. McKenzie decides he doesn't have months. He has a welding torch, a maintenance hanger that empties out after 2,200 hours, and an idea the engineering manuals say is impossible. Paul McKenzie is not supposed to revolutionize anything. 32 years old, high school diploma from McCook, Nebraska, he joined the Army in 1940 because the tractor factory laid him off. His personnel file lists him as adequate mechanic, below average academic aptitude. He failed the aircraft mechanic certification test twice before passing on his 3rd attempt. What the tests don't measure is McKenzie's 6 years at the Caterpillar plant, where he worked on oil cooling systems for engines that operated in 110-degree heat, covered in dust that clogged every filter. Caterpillar's solution wasn't elegant. It was brutal and effective. When an oil cooler couldn't handle the load, you didn't redesign the cooler. You gave the oil somewhere else to shed heat before it reached critical components. A bypass system. Crude, simple, universally mocked by engineers as shade tree mechanics nonsense. McKenzie's moment of insight comes on October 23, 1943, 9 days after Black Thursday. He's performing a post-flight inspection on Made in America, a B-17G that returned on 2 engines after a mission to Schweinfurt. The number 3 engine is a total loss. Seized piston, scored cylinders, destroyed bearings. But what catches McKenzie's attention is the intact oil cooler. The component that's supposed to prevent overheating survived just fine. It just couldn't work fast enough when the damaged engine dumped superheated oil back into the system. He walks to the number 1 engine, still functional, traces the oil lines with his fingers, from the tank, through the pump, into the engine, out through the return line, through the cooler, back to the tank. A closed loop. When one engine bleeds oil and overheats, the entire system struggles to compensate. That's the problem, McKenzie mutters to Corporal Eddie Valdez, his assistant. It's trying to cool oil that's already too hot. By the time it hits the cooler, the damage is done. So cool it before it gets there, Valdez says. McKenzie stops, looks at his corporal. Say that again. Cool it before it gets there, before it circulates back to the other engines. It's stupidly simple. Every B-17 engine has an oil cooler, but the cooler only works on oil returning from the engine to the tank. If you could create a secondary cooling path, a crude radiator that oil passed through before entering the cooler, you could shed the initial thermal spike, lower the peak temperature, give the main cooler a fighting chance. McKenzie sketches it on a grease-stained notepad. A secondary loop, copper tubing, a small automotive-style heat exchanger mounted in the slipstream, a one-way valve to regulate flow. Total parts cost, maybe $8. Installation time, 4 hours per engine. He knows immediately what the response will be. The technical manuals specify exact oil routing. You cannot modify certified engine systems without engineering approval. The Wright R-1820's oil system is calibrated for precise flow rates and pressures. Introducing unauthorized bypass loops could starve engines of lubrication, causing catastrophic failures. But McKenzie also knows this. In 6 weeks of combat operations, 40% of damaged B-17s are lost to engine seizure, not combat damage. The rules say his modification is forbidden. The body counts say he has to try. McKenzie begins his unauthorized modification program on October 26, 1943, at 22:30 hours. The maintenance hangar is officially closed. The flight line is dark except for perimeter lights. He wheels a tool cart into the back corner where they park damaged aircraft awaiting cannibalization for parts. Tonight's subject is B-17F, serial number 4230633, Lil Abner. She took flak through the number 2 nacelle over Bremen. The engine is salvageable if McKenzie's idea works. The parts came from 3 sources. The copper tubing came from a British plumbing supplier in Cambridge. McKenzie paid out of pocket, told them he was fixing base showers. The heat exchanger is from a 1938 Ford truck radiator, sectioned down to fit inside an engine nacelle. The one-way bypass valve is Caterpillar Surplus, model J47, designed for oil regulation on bulldozer hydraulics. Total cost, $4.23. The installation violates Technical Order 01-20EG2, unauthorized engine modifications, risk court-martial under Article 92, failure to obey order or regulation, and could result in the destruction of a $238,000 aircraft if the theory is wrong. McKenzie doesn't tell anyone what he's doing except Corporal Valdez and Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan, the flight engineer. Sullivan's test pilot experience makes him essential. If the modification fails in flight, Sullivan needs to know how to shut it down before it destroys the engine. The modification is crude. McKenzie taps into the oil return line between the engine and the main cooler. The tap diverts 20% of the flow through his jury-rigged copper tubing, which snakes through the heat exchanger mounted in the slipstream, then returns to the main line via the one-way valve. If oil temperature stays below threshold, the valve stays closed. If it spikes, the valve opens, forcing hot oil through the auxiliary cooling path. At 0347 hours on October 27th, they finish the installation. The modification is invisible from the ground. The tubing runs inside existing nacelle structures. Only someone inspecting the oil return manifold would notice the extra lines. "What do we tell the pilot?" Valdez asks. "Nothing," McKenzie says. "If it works, he won't notice. If it fails, he trails off. If it fails, the engine seizes mid-flight. Lil Abner crashes. 3 officers and 6 enlisted men die. McKenzie faces murder charges. They fire up the engine at AO 4:30 hours before dawn. McKenzie monitors oil pressure and temperature gauges with a flashlight. The engine runs normally for 15 minutes. He signals Sullivan to advance throttle to combat power, the equivalent of what the engine would experience at altitude under load. Oil temperature climbs 80 degrees, 90 degrees, 100 degrees. At 103 degrees, McKenzie hears a soft click, the bypass valve opening. Oil diverts through his auxiliary system. The temperature holds at 107 degrees for 12 minutes, then drops to 95 as the main cooler catches up. It works. Sullivan kills the engine, looks at McKenzie in the darkness. "Paul, that's illegal as hell." "Yeah," McKenzie says. "It is? When do we test it in combat?" The first combat test happens by accident. On November 3, 1943, Lil Abner is assigned to a mission against Wilhelmshaven because they're short 3 aircraft, and she's the only B-17 available with 4 functional engines. Lieutenant Robert Kessler pilots her, unaware his number 2 engine has an unauthorized modification. Over the target, flak shreds the number 3 engine's oil system. Kessler feathers the prop, standard procedure. But unlike every other damaged B-17 Kessler has flown, the remaining engines don't start overheating. Oil temperatures rise to 102 degrees and hold. Lil Abner makes it home on 3 engines, lands safely. Post-flight inspection shows the remaining engines barely stressed. Kessler's report reaches Major William Gross, the group engineering officer, who immediately inspects Lil Abner. He finds McKenzie's modification within 20 minutes. "Who authorized this?" Gross demands. McKenzie, standing at attention in the hangar, says nothing. He cannot lie to an officer. He also cannot afford to admit he violated technical orders. "This modification is not in any manual I've ever read," Gross continues. "It's crude. It's unmonitored. If that bypass valve fails, oil pressure drops, the engine seizes, and 10 men die. Do you understand that, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "Then why the hell did you install it?" McKenzie meets his eyes. "Because 40% of our birds bleed out from engine overheating after combat damage, sir. This modification kept number 2 and 4 from seizing when number 3 went down." "If it hadn't been there, Lieutenant Kessler would have ditched in the North Sea." Gross stares at him. "You tested this on a combat aircraft without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You risked a crew's lives on an untested theory." "Sir, we lose 60 bombers a month to engine failure after damage. The official solution is 8 months out. I couldn't wait 8 months." The room erupts. 2 captains and a major start shouting simultaneously. McKenzie is ordered to remove the modification immediately. He's told a formal investigation will determine if he faces court-martial. Group Commander Colonel Vance calls it the most reckless act of insubordination I've encountered in 22 years of service. McKenzie removes the modification that afternoon. Lil Abner returns to standard configuration. But Lieutenant Kessler, the pilot, does something unauthorized himself. He walks into Colonel Vance's office and requests a meeting. With him are his co-pilot, flight engineer, and 5 other pilots who flew on November 3rd. "Sir," Kessler says, "with respect, Sergeant McKenzie's modification saved my crew. I've flown 18 missions. I've seen 4 B-17s go down from engine cascades after flak damage. Lil Abner took the same hit, and we made it home. Whatever he did, it worked." The other pilots agree. Captain James Hartford, who's flown 31 missions, adds, "Sir, I'll fly any aircraft McKenzie modifies. If his trick gives us a better chance against engine failure, I want it on my bird." Colonel Vance listens. Then he makes a decision that contradicts every regulation manual. "Major Gross, you will work with Sergeant McKenzie to document this modification. We'll test it properly. Ground tests, controlled flight tests, stress analysis. If it holds up, we'll present it to 8th Air Force Engineering. But if this fails and kills a crew, McKenzie, You'll answer for it. Understood? Yes, sir. Over the next 3 weeks, McKenzie installs his modification on 6 B-17s under engineering supervision. They run exhaustive ground tests, simulating single engine loss, dual engine loss, oil system damage. The results are consistent. When one engine fails, McKenzie's auxiliary cooling system reduces thermal stress on remaining engines by 42%. Time to critical overheating increases from 8 minutes to 23 minutes. On November 26th, the 6 modified aircraft fly a combat mission to Bremen. 2 take flak damage to engines. Both return safely. Neither experiences cascade failures. The data goes to 8th Air Force Headquarters on December 1st. Colonel Curtis LeMay reviews it personally. His response, "I don't care if it's unauthorized. If it works, I want it on every B-17 in England by February." If you're fascinated by these incredible untold stories of innovation under pressure, hit that subscribe button now. We've got an entire series coming on the mechanics, engineers, and crews who changed the war from the ground up, stories you won't find anywhere else. January 11th, 1944. Mission to Oschersleben, Germany. 91 B-17s from the 91st and 306th bomb. Groups face the heaviest flak concentration yet recorded. By the time they clear the target area, 34 aircraft have sustained engine damage from anti-aircraft fire. In the pre-McKenzie era, just 3 months earlier, 26 of those damaged bombers would have been lost to cascading engine failures. The crews would have bailed out over Germany, ditched in the North Sea, or crashed attempting emergency landings. Today, 28 aircraft make it home. Only 6 are lost to engine failure. The difference? McKenzie's modification, now installed on 73% of the 8th Air Force's B-17 fleet. Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson, 91st Bomb Group Operations Officer, writes in his after-action report, "Multiple aircraft sustained catastrophic damage to primary engines but maintained sufficient power on remaining engines to reach friendly territory." Previously, this level of damage resulted in certain loss. The engine cooling modifications have demonstrably improved survival rates. The data becomes impossible to ignore. From October through December 1943, before widespread modification, the 8th Air Force loses 388 B-17s. Of these, 164 are attributable to engine failure following combat damage. That's 42%. From January through March 1944, with McKenzie modifications installed, losses dropped to 197 B-17s, with only 39 attributable to engine cascade failure. That's 20%, a 52% reduction. Translated to human lives, McKenzie's $4 valve and copper tubing modification saves an estimated 1,250 airmen in the first 3 months alone. But the real test comes on February 20th, 1944, during Big Week, the massive coordinated assault on German aircraft production facilities. The 8th Air Force launches 9 Ki-41 heavy bombers against targets deep in Germany. It's the largest daylight raid in history, and flak gunners tear into the formations with brutal accuracy. Captain Thomas Harrigan, piloting Hell's Fury out of the 306th Bomb Group, takes a direct 88mm hit to his No. 4 engine over Leipzig. The explosion tears away the entire oil cooler assembly. Oil pressure drops to 0 in 45 seconds. The engine seizes, the propeller feathers successfully, but superheated oil has already dumped into the return lines. In older B-17s, this is where the death spiral begins. The remaining 3 engines struggle to compensate. Oil temperatures skyrocket. Bearings fail. Within 10 minutes, a second engine seizes. The bomber cannot maintain altitude and falls out of formation. Easy prey for fighters. But Hell's Fury has McKenzie's modification. The bypass valves on engines 1, 2, and 3 open immediately, when they detect the thermal spike. Hot oil diverts through the auxiliary cooling loops. The slipstream-mounted heat exchangers shed temperature. Oil returning to the main coolers drops from 128 degrees Celsius to 94 degrees. Harrigan's flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Philip Reyes, monitors the gauges in disbelief. "Skipper, oil temps are holding. Number 4's gone, but 1, 2, and 3 are stable." Hell's Fury limps home on 3 engines. No cascade failure. No emergency bailout. 10 men survive who should have died. Harrigan's debriefing is forwarded directly to General Carl Spaatz, commanding U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. Spatz's handwritten note on the report: "This modification is not optional. Install on all heavy bombers immediately." The German perspective adds a haunting confirmation. After the war, Luftwaffe records reveal that German fighter tactics from late 1943 specifically targeted B-17 engines, knowing that single-engine hits often cause cascade failures that eliminated the bomber without continued fighter engagement. Oberleutnant Klaus Mitusch, a German ace with 72 kills, noted in his diary, "One 20mm cannon hit to a Fortress engine nacelle used to guarantee a kill within 10 minutes. By February 44, they were making it home on 2 engines. We had to expend twice the ammunition per kill." German pilots feared the B-17's defensive firepower. One pilot famously compared attacking a formation to making love to a porcupine on fire. But they relied on the engine vulnerability to bring bombers down. When that vulnerability decreased, German fighter losses increased. The balance of attrition shifted. By March 1944, McKenzie's modification is standard across all B-17G and H models. Boeing incorporates a refined version into production bombers, though the field-installed variants remain simpler and easier to maintain. Wright Aeronautical publishes a formal technical order authorizing the installation, giving retroactive legitimacy to what began as a court-martial-worthy breach of regulations. The statistics are stark. Before modification, B-17 crew survival rate for 25 mission tour, 25%. After modification, B-17 crew survival rate for 25 mission tour, 51% engine failure losses, October-December 1943, 164 aircraft engine failure losses, January-March 1944, 39 aircraft estimated lives saved, January 1944, May 1945, 4,200 airmen. In April 1944, Master Sergeant Paul McKenzie receives the Legion of Merit from General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January. The citation reads, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services, Master Sergeant McKenzie conceived, designed, and implemented a field modification to B-17 engine cooling systems that directly resulted in the preservation of American lives and the continued effectiveness of strategic bombing operations." McKenzie is promoted to technical sergeant and offered a position at Wright Field as a civilian consultant. He declines. "I'm a mechanic," he tells Colonel Vance. "My place is on the flight line." The veterans remember. Decades later, at a 91st Bomb Group reunion in 1987, Captain Thomas Harrigan, the pilot of Hell's Fury, finds McKenzie in the crowd. Harrigan is 71 years old. McKenzie is 76. "Because of you," Harrigan says, his voice breaking, "I got to come home. I got to see my kids grow up, my grandchildren, all of us in that room." He gestures to 200 veterans. "We're here because you broke the rules." McKenzie, uncomfortable with the attention, just nods. "I did what needed doing." This story is just one example of the incredible ingenuity that happened every day in World War II. If you want more deep dives into the innovations that actually won the war, told with this level of detail, make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell so you never miss an upload. We've got 3 more stories like this dropping next month. The B-17 engine cooling modification outlives the war. When the conflict ends in August 1945, Boeing has produced 12,631 flying fortresses. Of these, 4,735 were lost in combat. Analysis shows that without McKenzie's modification, losses would have exceeded 6,200 aircraft, an additional 1,465 bombers. At 10 crew per aircraft, that's 14,050 lives saved by a Nebraska tractor mechanic with a welding torch. The modification's influence extends beyond World War II. Post-war aircraft engine design incorporates auxiliary cooling loops as standard practice. The principle, pre-cooling high-temperature oil, before it enters primary cooling systems, becomes foundational in jet engine development. Modern military aircraft from the F-15 to the C-130 use descendants of McKenzie's crude bypass system. In the 1950s and 60s, surplus B-17s are converted into aerial firefighting tankers. 35% of those aircraft are lost in crashes, but the survivors credit their engine cooling systems, still using McKenzie-style auxiliary loops, with allowing damaged engines to continue operating long enough to reach emergency landing sites. Paul McKenzie himself returns to Nebraska in November 1945. He works at a John Deere dealership until retirement in 1978. He attends a handful of veteran reunions, but refuses interviews. When a military historian contacts him in 1983 for an oral history project, McKenzie declines. "I wasn't nobody special," he says. "I just fixed engines. That's what mechanics do." He never patents his modification, never writes a book, never seeks recognition. When Boeing sends him a letter in 1968 acknowledging that modern multi-engine cooling systems are based on principles he pioneered, he frames it and hangs it in his garage, then never mentions it to anyone. McKenzie dies in 1996 at age 85. His obituary in the McCook Daily Gazette is 4 sentences long, mentioning only that he served in the Army Air Forces and worked at the local dealership. But at his funeral, something extraordinary happens. 73 men, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, travel from across the country to attend. They are the survivors. The men who flew in B-17s with McKenzie's modification. The men who took flak hits and made it home when the math said they shouldn't have. They don't deliver eulogies. They don't make speeches. They just stand in silence at the graveside, men in their 70s and 80s, and one by one they salute. Because Paul McKenzie taught them, and us, something the technical manuals never could. Innovation doesn't always come from laboratories and engineering departments. Sometimes it comes from the people in the grease-stained coveralls, working through the night, who see a problem and refuse to accept that the solution is 8 months away. Sometimes the difference between life and death is a mechanic willing to break the rules because saving lives matters more than following orders. 12,731 B-17s were built. 4,200 lives were saved by an $4 modification. One mechanic changed the course of the air war, then went back to Nebraska and never said a word about it. That's the kind of hero the history books forget, but the men who came home never did.